All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Ask the Experts session on enterprise-grade Kubernetes on Azure. Thank you all so much for joining us. We have a great set of experts here today to answer any questions you might have, whether it be general questions about running Kubernetes or about any of the specific features that we've launched this week. So without further ado, let's get started. So hopefully you all see a chat window on the right-hand side of your screen. Please use this chat window to ask any of your questions. Our team will go ahead and moderate these questions, and at that point, they'll appear to all attendees. And if you see a question that you like and would like to have answered, please go ahead and upvote that question. I'll be selecting questions and posing them to our panel of experts. And if there are any resources that we'd like to point you to, we'll be sure to share them when the session concludes. Please keep in mind that the session is being recorded, and please do help out our team and avoid spamming them with questions or any inappropriate comments in the chat. I promise you that there are real people behind the curtain here. And lastly, let's all be kind and courteous and follow the Microsoft Code of Conduct. We've gone over this in a lot of sessions, so we'll just jump into introductions. I'm Shakti Vetrivel. I'm a program manager at Microsoft, and I work on Azure Kubernetes Service. And I'm based here in Seattle, Washington. Sean, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So I'm Sean McKenna. I'm the lead PM for AKS, also based in Seattle. So nice late evening chatting with you all. Dennis?
Dennis, would you like to make an introduction?
My name is Dennis. I'm a cloud native architect based out of Germany, so I'm primarily working with customers.
And Gustav / Keiko?
Yeah, so I'm Keiko today. We've got some issues, but my name is Gustav. I'm also a part of the global black belt team covering EMEA as a region, based in Copenhagen, focused on customers and Kubernetes.
Awesome. So let's get started with the fun part, answering some questions.
All right, well, I'll throw out a question to Dennis. Since you're working with a lot of our largest customers in Europe, what are some of the hurdles that you see customers who are new to Kubernetes running into as they get onboarded into the platform?
Okay, so good question. I mean, typically networking is something that is not easy to understand, and also something that typically cannot reverse. So just kind of the decisions you have to figure out how you integrate Kubernetes containers, hosts into your network, make it available and connected. I think there are a couple of trade-offs and decisions you have to make that are not as obvious. Something else that's relevant for a couple of customers, how you do maintenance of infrastructure, Kubernetes clusters, as well as containers in a frictionless way. And I would say security is also something that comes up quite a lot because Kubernetes seems to be not as easy to understand from a security perspective than a normal infrastructure-based application. So any of those would be, I think, interesting to answer.
Maybe coming from the we talked about security for a second. If you're coming from a traditional IaaS, VM-based environment, what are some of the things that you find customers struggle with or need to learn or unlearn as they move to Kubernetes?
I think the layering of different concepts is the so you have to understand how Linux as an operating system works. I mean, Kubernetes abstracts a lot of these things away from you, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can forget to understand how DNS works, how load balancing works, and how traffic is routed inside the cluster. Particularly DNS is something that I think has more than once surprised us in customer applications, where you can assume that DNS just simply works, like on the internet, you type your URL and you get it resolved. This is not something that always works as expected in a distributed environment. And I think this is where we also kind of learned kind of the 3.N.5, I think is something very popular. We've seen DNS timeouts. And I think this is also where in the product we've been doing a couple of optimizations to make it easier to understand and deploy in these environments. What else? And security, I mean, I think we've done a couple of improvements here. Security Center allows you to integrate and monitor for obvious mistakes that you can kind of do. But there are also still lots of third-party solutions out there which are not as easy to understand in terms of the different capabilities and how to choose from what is available there. I think this is also something that takes a lot of time conversations, kind of how to choose between which solution actually serves your needs.
Definitely. I see we're starting to get some questions coming through on the chat. So I see Keiko is responding to this one, but I might take a cut at it. So if you're coming from an infrastructure Wintel background and wondering why to go AKS versus straight to serverless. So it's a great question. We get this question often of, why should I choose Kubernetes versus, whether it's app service or Azure Functions or one of the other options available. I generally start out by talking about, if you can start at the highest layer of abstraction possible, right? So if you're looking at the suite of options within the Azure portfolio and the compute portfolio, if you look at something like Azure Functions and you say, look, I'm building typically a greenfield application, something that is going to be event-driven, that I really want to avoid. I don't have the need to have a bunch of control of the infrastructure or really detailed sort of configuration of the infrastructure. That is very likely, in fact, almost certainly going to be the highest productivity solution that you can use, right? It's a very developer-oriented solution, great tooling. You don't have to think about the infrastructure at all. That is probably going to be a way for you to deliver more business value faster than going to something like Kubernetes, which is going to introduce a lot more infrastructure into your life and a lot more complexity. That being said, some of those higher abstraction services are much more opinionated, right? They're purpose-built for certain types of workloads. And so as they are purpose-built, they are somewhat constrained, right? So if you need to go outside of the confines of what those services provide and are built for, then it's either extremely difficult or in a lot of cases impossible. And so then you have to start looking at some of the lower layers in the stack, and that's where something like the Kubernetes and AKS come in. There's also obviously an element of environment portability that comes with Kubernetes. So if you need to run that application in much the same way and operate it in much the same way across Azure, maybe an on-prem environment, maybe other public cloud environments, then Kubernetes is going to give you a much more consistent interface to doing that management than you would get with one of the higher level services. And so that's something you just need, only you understand how important that is to you. But certainly another factor to keep in mind in thinking about the options are on the table. So I think that's kind of the starting point to decide. I generally always say, you'll hear a lot of hype around Kubernetes, and so a lot of people come to it assuming this is going to be a silver bullet to solve all the problems, and any challenges that you have are something that Kubernetes can take care of. I wouldn't necessarily believe that, even as the product owner for AKS. So definitely look at the other solutions that are on the table and find the thing that is best suited to what you're trying to do.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Sean. Gustav, I have a question for you. A lot of companies have been impacted by COVID-19, and a lot of folks are looking to minimize costs across the board. What are some options for them to minimize costs when using AKS?
That's a pretty good question. We see different kinds of scenario out there. The biggest one is consolidation of clusters. So we see that customers are consolidating on fewer clusters and make use of multi-tenancy within inside the clusters using namespaces. I think that generalizes pretty much what we see out there overall. So that's definitely something I would suggest looking into. And also make sure that your clusters that you currently have are working efficiently. That means that you are using the resources that you scaled out with. If your node pools are too big or too small, try to see if you can resize some of these.
Got it. Dennis, do you know how customers should make sure that they're upgrading to the latest Kubernetes versions and how AKS handles upgrades?
Today, customers have to make a choice. I mean, there's always, I think, a flavor of preview versions that customer can use, and we encourage them actually to try them out because they can be available, and breaking changes might be. But we're also advocating or aggregating coming changes in the Azure Advisor and the cluster board. So customers can look at each individual cluster, can see if they're using deprecated APIs that are coming in the next version or maybe changing in the next version. But we're also aggregating dashboards across all clusters and giving you a heads up if there is kind of CVEs available or if there are general deprecations of any Kubernetes version. As a general guidance, you need to update at some point in time, quite regularly, and you should practice this. So I think you shouldn't get attached to any of Kubernetes version because they will change, and we will give you pings and guidance either per email to the security center or the Azure Advisor, and notifications in which you can trigger an upgrade, test them across dev stage and production environment across your subscriptions, and then validate if your application still works correctly as you would expect.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Dennis. Sean, it looks like we have a question about Windows. Can you provide an update on when Windows 2004 images will be supported in AKS?
I think Keiko might have been answering that in chat, maybe not. So we are currently on Server 2019 LTS. We are currently only offering process isolated Windows containers in AKS, which for those folks who are familiar with how Windows containers works, means that there's actually a challenge in introducing new base OS versions because the host OS and the container OS need to match to ensure compatibility, which is why we haven't introduced later versions of Windows Server. So we're in the process of enabling Hyper-V isolation support to solve that problem. So if you think about the alternative option that we have is that every time you create a node pool, you can specify the exact version of Windows that you want to offer, but that becomes kind of a maintenance headache over time as more and more Windows versions get released. And so the model that we're going to move to is that we will offer Hyper-V isolation to deal with those cases where the host and the container OS are not matched. And what that does in practice is those Hyper-V isolated containers end up running inside of their own lightweight VM, which means that the kernel is actually inside of that VM, so it can match whatever the container OS is, while all running on the same underlying VM. So that's the model by which we will start to introduce new versions of Windows Server, and that is something that we are looking to take to a public preview state here over the next few months. So stay tuned for that.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. Heading back over to Dennis, do you know how customers should be choosing between Azure Kubernetes Service and Azure Red Hat OpenShift?
Well, generally, the customers have already made a choice. So OpenShift or Red Hat particularly comes with its own ecosystem that developers and customers appreciate it for longer periods of time because they can bring up different level of support that is significantly longer than normal Kubernetes ecosystem. It also comes with a wide variety of operators and tools surrounding kind of running databases, running stateful applications inside a cluster, and so bringing also support to these kind of things. While you can get pretty much the same technology inside a plain Kubernetes environment, this usually requires you to make a decision to evaluate different open source alternatives, make a choice, and also take more responsibility for running them. while Red Hat on the other side kind of tests them very thoroughly for multiple years, maintains them also for longer periods than the community does, and gives you a couple of higher level tooling for kind of considering the source to image, which allows you to start from source code and build a continuous CI/CD pipeline to run containers, which is one of the things that Red Hat builds in there, but also a couple of very advanced security networking features that kind of differ how Kubernetes typically works in the open source version. For example, in plain Kubernetes, every container is allowed to talk to everyone. You have to typically design your security limits inside each environment, while Openshift pretty much brings this right out of the box, which is, I would say, very secure default. So in essence, you can achieve the same. It's just a difference in if you want to invest in something that is bought and vetted by a professional company, or if you want to hire people and embed them in the ecosystem, open source communities, to make more of your own decisions to probably achieve similar goals.
Awesome. Thank you, Dennis. Over to Gustav, I have a question about container security. I know Dennis covered this a bit earlier, but in terms of container security, what sort of options do customers have in terms of what can be easily integrated with AKS? And what sort of third-party tools would you recommend as well?
That's actually a good question, also a larger question. But overall, what we typically see customers are doing is sticking with the classic tools. That's Aqua, Twistlock, for example. We have our own platform, Azure Security Center, which help you out securing all of these. Furthermore, you can use Azure policies to restrict or allow certain services that are pushed into a container. So using these tools is definitely something that we do recommend for customers.
Got it. Thank you. Sean, it looks like we have a question about domain names. So with Azure Web Service, domains are managed internally, so it's pretty easy to set up. How do you do this with AKS? Is there some sort of automation for Azure DNS setup, or do you manually set everything up?
Coming off of mute. So we do have a built-in capability that is primarily for sort of dev test setups called HTTP application routing that allows you to easily create services that get their own FQDNs generated into Azure DNS. Like I said, that's mostly for dev test scenarios today. It's something we're looking at transitioning into more of a production grade capability. Outside of that, to move into kind of a production environment, that is something that is a little bit more DIY today. You do end up having to create the Azure DNS resource and manage it. There are tools out there that can make that simpler. Things like external DNS as an open source project that can help sort of bridge that gap between the services that you're defining in Kubernetes and those DNS records that are managed in Azure DNS. But frankly, if we sort of zoom out a little bit, that is one of those things we talked earlier about, when to decide or how to decide about different compute solutions and thinking about things like serverless and app service. This is a case where app service is very concretely purpose-built for your building a web application. Everybody that builds a web application is going to need a DNS entry, is going to need a certificate associated with that DNS entry. And so that service is built to nail that scenario, whereas Kubernetes is a general purpose compute platform. You can use it to build web services. You can use it to run, ML training and inference. You can use it to run batch jobs. There's like any number of different things that you can do with the tool. And so it hasn't been really explicitly optimized for any of these scenarios to the same degree as some of those higher level PaaS services. Now, over time, there's obviously patterns that emerge and we want to try and go and make easier on top of AKS, but I think you're always going to see that some of those higher level abstractions are just going to have a smoother integration for some of those scenarios that are sort of right down the middle of the types of applications that they're targeting.
Awesome. And speaking of Azure Web Apps, can you elaborate a bit more on how folks should migrate multi-tenant databases, since microservices recommend having a separate database for each microservice? Should they instead split a single tenant's database into multiple databases? How should folks handle that, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of gets into just general sort of microservice architecture, and not anything that's specific to AKS per se, but certainly, yeah, if you're following kind of the microservice Bible, then you would say each service should have its own data store, and so you'll want to split those out so that you can have, think about like an individual app dev team within the organization that's building the service. They can also manage the associated data store. And from a multi-tenancy perspective, yeah, that means splitting out the individual tenants' data store as well. I think in practice, a lot of folks are not following that dogma necessarily, either because trying to manage all of those individual data stores becomes a pain for the organization as a whole, or oftentimes you've got existing data stores and structures that are in place that you need to interop with. And so the idea of just kind of like starting from scratch and splitting everything and slicing it up is a non-starter. And so I wouldn't get too hung up on making sure that you're doing exactly what the kind of microservice reference architecture says. You obviously have to kind of work within the constraints that you have. But yeah, if you were trying to build from scratch and target that pattern, then you would end up splitting things out.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. Gustav, it looks like we have a question about Arc. Could you explain a bit about how Arc works with Kubernetes workloads?
Yeah, so we do see different use cases from a customer perspective. It's often that they want to control Kubernetes clusters that not necessarily are living in Azure, but also GKE or EKS on premises, even Openshift as well on premises, and they want to put down some governance on these rules. They want to have some policies. They want to be controlling what you can deploy. And all these features mixed with identity and controlling what folks can be doing is something that is actually quite nice to have in those environments. So these are typically scenarios that we see Azure Arc to be used. So it's basically an extension of your manageability of Kubernetes clusters that you can do today. Also deployment of packages into your clusters if you want to enable some monitoring or other services. You can definitely do that. It has the GitOps function as well, which you also can integrate. So there's a lot of cool features you can do in there, and there's also a bunch of more coming as well in that sense.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Gustav. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Dennis, it looks like we have a question from Vishnu. He says, setting up a background job, especially long-running jobs, are hectic in Kubernetes. Any news or advice there?
So unfortunately, there's no good indication of what hectic means, but I make a couple of assumptions. So things that are tricky in long-running jobs is the scale up and the scale down, as well as the insurance that the jobs run continuously. Unfortunately, Kubernetes doesn't, when scaling up, you have multiple replicas, assuming you have some kind of batching skew. So generally, what we recommend in these scenarios is you put all your jobs in some kind of queuing system. So this can be a service bus, a Kafka, or Event Hub, or a kind of simple database that maintains the individual jobs. What you then need is something that makes a decision of kind of basically picking these jobs and scheduling them somewhere in Kubernetes. The built-in features of jobs don't bring necessarily good capabilities to this, but we've contributed to an open source project called CADA, which helps you do this. So CADA essentially allows you to pick different kind of indicators of when to spawn jobs in Kubernetes. You could configure this and bind this to various metrics like simple database queries or kind of length of some message queue, which will then be used by CADA to spawn individual containers which run their jobs. The tricky part about Kubernetes particularly is the scale. This is how you solve the scale up problem. More tricky to solve the scale down because when a job has been completed in a normal horizontal pod autoscaler, Kubernetes will randomly kill individual instances, completely disregarding if these jobs have been finished or not. Which is why I would say the only thing that decently works is using the Kubernetes built-in job model to implement a long-running operation and ensure that you have kind of run them through completion if they've been configured correctly, and if necessary, restart them again by your kind of CADA-based trigger. That is something that decently works, but in general, this is not something that we're seeing quite common. So it's mostly about have items in the queue to process, or have kind of images in my storage account which contain images that I need to analyze by some machine learning. These are things that work quite well, but none of these run longer than a couple of minutes or hours at most. For other things, if you're running really long jobs, maybe Azure Batch might be something you want to look into because it builds or has more advanced scheduling and job management capabilities for this.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Dennis. I think we have time for one more quick question. Sean, do you want to go over where customers can find what's new in the service?
Sure. So we've been doing quite a bit of investment around transparency in what we're doing from a roadmap perspective and our weekly releases. So you can find that all out on our GitHub page, just github.com/azure/AKS. So that's where you'll find the public roadmap, which includes the vast majority of things that we're working on, broken down into the segments of things moving through the pipeline. That's where you'll also find release notes. Like I say, we push out every week as we release new features and fix bugs and so on. It's also where you can report issues. So if you have a problem with AKS, and particularly something that you can clearly reproduce, that you want us to take a look at, you can file an issue on there, and typically somebody from the product team will get back to you. So that's probably the best place to go to get really detailed information about the things that we're shipping. Obviously, there's things like Ignite where there's broader announcements and blog posts and that sort of thing. But if you want to be really up to date with what's happening kind of week to week, and be able to watch things move through the pipeline of the roadmap, that would be the best place to go.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sean. And that takes us to the very end of our session. We do want to leave you with a set of resources to check out if you didn't get your questions answered. We have the AKS public roadmap that Sean mentioned just now, and also AKS/issues, where you can make feature requests or post about any issues that you might be seeing with AKS. We love to interact with all of you there. And if this session sparked your curiosity a bit and you're excited to see what we launched this week as a part of Ignite, Brendan Burns also has a great blog post just consolidating all of that information. So that's all from us. Thank you all for joining us, and stay safe and enjoy the rest of Virtual Ignite.